Welcome, everyone. I'm Joel Witt. I'm a distinguished fellow at the Henry L. Stimson Center. Today, we've convened a panel to discuss a midterm report on the Biden administration's North Korea policy. And we thought it'd be a particularly good time since we're a little past 2 years into the administration. And so we wanted to take stock on what the administration is doing in terms of North Korea. I think it's pretty clear to everyone, even the most casual observer, that the situation in Northeast Asia, and especially on the Korean Peninsula, has become much more dangerous over the past 2 years. And the administration is trying to deal with this growing threat posed by North Korea, but also with China in the background. So the issue before us today is very simple. How effective has the Biden administration's policy been in dealing with the growing threat from Pyongyang? And are there steps that we should be taking that we aren't? I suspect finding possible solutions isn't going to be as simple as evaluating the current situation. So we'll have 90 minutes to discuss this issue, first with our 4 panelists. Each will speak for 10 minutes, and then I may ask a few questions of them, but I would like to get to the audience for questions. So why don't we start with Bob Gallucci? I'm not going to go into the long spiel about everyone's bio. I think everyone probably knows who Bob Gallucci is. He's now a professor at Georgetown. I'm sure he's always introduced as having negotiated the 1994 agreed framework and, everything since then. So anyway, please, Bob, go ahead.
Thanks, Joel. I took my task as the first one speaking here to do the report card. And so I've done a report card. I teach at Georgetown, so I figured this made some sense. And I picked 5 parameters to evaluate Biden administration policy. U.S. policy objectives, the U.S. strategy to achieve those objectives, the response to the threat to the United States from North Korea's policy, U.S. declaratory policy, and then U.S. diplomatic posture. Those are the 5 parameters. And I've done the grading, and I must say, these grades wouldn't do well at Georgetown. I mean, this is painful. So let me start with U.S. policy objective. I've given that an A- over a D+. The A- comes because there's something of a debate going on, at least in Washington, over whether it would be wise for the United States to give up its objective of a complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. I think the debate is appropriate, and I'm glad it's happening. But I think the correct answer is the one the administration came to, and that's why the A- part of the grade. Complete denuclearization is still the right goal. I think, it's a right statement of part of the goal. The D+ comes because it sitting out there, just naked. Our goal as a country is to get the denuclearization of the peninsula is rather sterile, and it's pretty clear why someone comes up with the view that that's not adequate. It isn't. I think that the important, essential thing is always to put that goal in the context of a policy aimed at normalization of relations between the DPRK and the USA. Normalization is not a gift for the United States to give the North Koreans. It is something that we should be seeking in Northeast Asia, a normal relationship with this country. Combined with the denuclearization of the peninsula, it all makes sense to me. If you say only half of it, It doesn't make sense to me, and it sure doesn't make sense to the North Koreans, apparently. The second parameter is how good is the U.S. policy to achieve the objective? I think that's a clear D, and that's because if the strategy is pressure plus sanctions, I think one of the things that comes out of this is that it doesn't work, and it hasn't worked. That if the idea of pressure and sanctions together is to drive the North Koreans into negotiations and ultimately a bargain with the United States, it just hasn't been working. And a lot has been written about the effectiveness or lack thereof of sanctions. And North Koreans have got good at or better at evading those sanctions, so much less impact. As for the diplomacy, which is another part of the strategy, we haven't had any. And I should we bear some responsibility for that? I think yes. And so that's why the grade is low. I'd say that our strategy to achieve our goals has been ineffective. Third, how about our response to threat? This is where I think the administration gets an A, certainly with respect to effort and intent. I think the idea that we need to improve our working relationship with the ROK, our working relationship with the government of Japan, and as much as possible, trilateral communication and cooperation between the three of us in Northeast Asia is exactly right. And I have understood that not only is there an effort to do this in the military realm, but also in intelligence and sanctions coordination. So on those, in that way, I would assess it as being aimed at least the right targets. The fourth parameter, U.S. declaratory policy with North Korea, I'm back to a D+ here. I get U.S. policy from the National Security Advisor to be that we lead our declaratory policy with the phrase, no hostile intent. That to me is interesting because if they watch what we do rather than what they say, what they see are sanctions and pretty aggressive military exercises with our ally, the Republic of Korea. And for all we may be saying about no hostile intent, that can look pretty hostile, I would imagine. So I would say our declaratory posture has to be a little more robust than no hostile intent, and has to have no hostile intent with an effort to back that up in some way. Finally, U.S. diplomatic posture, again, a D+. By the way, if you wonder why the plus, we do that at Georgetown frequently. It mitigates a little bit of the D, and it recognizes a certain amount of grading for effort. And so I think there's a lot of effort here, just not a lot of results. So diplomatic posture, I take it again from the National Security Advisor that the United States of America has been very clear that we are ready to meet without preconditions. We've apparently told the North Koreans this something like 20 times. It would seem that it should sink in that that is not quite enough as a diplomatic posture. That we should figure out. I mean, I guess these guys never went to high school and were turned down for a date on Friday night. You can't just keep asking the same way the same person. It's not going to work. And I think that what we have to understand is from the North Korean perspective, they have a very, I think, simple question here. Is the game worth the candle? I mean, is engaging in negotiations with the United States worthwhile or likely to be worthwhile? We've given them no reason to think it would be worthwhile. The North Koreans I was struck by this in track 2 discussions I've had with them in the past, have always made clear that they think we are the stronger party of the two when they're speaking honestly, and they don't understand why we don't do what the stronger party is supposed to do, which is make the first concession. And they don't understand, or so they say, why we don't come up with a concession. And clearly, the two areas one would think about are sanctions and military exercises, things we could do that are substantive gestures that we mean to do business in negotiations. I don't think our posture has reflected that, and I think it needs to if we expect to engage them. Thank you. Over to you, Joel.
Joel, you're muted.
Sorry. Thanks, Bob. Moving on now to Bob Carlin.
Joel, thank you. I'm certainly in agreement with Bob Gallucci's grades. I wouldn't pay for my children to continue their education at that rate. I have a feeling. I just want to add some thoughts to maybe flesh out a few of the things that he said. I know, as Bob said, the U.S. has said it has repeatedly tried to contact the North, sent messages, I don't know what else. And I don't know what those messages contain. I don't know if any of us do. And the fact, I mean, it's quite possible that these were brilliantly worded, that they were diplomatically perfect. We can certainly hope that. I tend to doubt it. So in other words, what the North Koreans have been getting in terms of messages, as Bob suggests, may not nearly be enough to pique their interest. It's also true that there are examples of differences in the public and behind the scenes interchange. So it's entirely possible that behind the scenes, something else has gone on. We saw that during the Trump years. We have to be open to that possibility so that very negative North Korean public statements may not actually reflect something that has gone on behind the scenes. But the fact is, all we have is the public. That's all I have to speak to. And in that regard, I'd note in the first 2 years of the Biden administration, there have been differences in the North Korean approach. And thus, the possibilities, it seemed to me, for Washington maybe to get traction. In the first year, 2021, it seems to me, if you review North Korean statements, that they were something in a watchful waiting mode. They were listening to everything the administration said. They were trying to piece together what actually the policy was. As in the Party Congress of January 2021, they seemed to be leaving a door open, not very wide, but it was open. There were very few missile tests in 2021, almost as if they were holding back and waiting. That changed in 2022. There was a period in the first 3 months of 2022 when the Russians and the Chinese made a concerted effort, I think, to signal to the Americans that what was necessary was not this repetition of jingles, and jingles is the Chinese term they use to describe what we were doing, but that we needed to take practical steps. First, as Bob suggests, the United States needed to actually do something, not just say things. Interestingly, the North Koreans picked that up and began to replay that, which to me meant they were saying, yes, let's see some meat on the table first. That went away by March or so. I have a feeling that the election of President Yoon in South Korea made a difference. He had said some very provocative things and continued to do so. And so the North Koreans are feeding that into their understanding of what's possible. I think what we need to do beginning in 2022 is entertain the possibility that there has been a new strategic decision in Pyongyang. The old engine of their foreign policy for 20 plus years was what Kim Il-sung decided in 1990. That is, they needed to get normal relations with the United States as a buffer against China and Russia. That continued, I would say, up until the Singapore meeting, even in Hanoi. I'm afraid that might be gone now. I'm afraid they might have decided that is not anymore going to be the basis of their engagement with the United States. And if that's true, as Bob suggests, that they have new questions. Why do we want to engage the United States? On what basis? To what end? And nothing that the Washington has done, it seems to me, makes it clear to them or answers that for them so that they'd feel the time is right to try to engage again. The only thing I can suggest is that we keep a close eye on the North Korean economic policy. From 2012 through 2020, there was significant across the board new economic policy by Kim Jong-un. That was intended to feed into, it seemed to me, their efforts to engage the Americans, not because they wanted goodies from us, but because they thought they needed an external environment which should be conducive to the sorts of changes they were trying to accomplish. Whether or not we get that opportunity again, we'll have to see. Right now, the North Koreans are not in that mode. That would be the only opening I could imagine and the only basis on which they would be prepared to deal with us. If we keep thinking they're going to deal with us going along the old lines and that the old jingles are going to appeal to them, I'm afraid we're going to fall from a D+ to a D-.
Thanks, Bob. Susan?
Yeah, thanks to everyone, and thanks for having me here. I'm here, I realize, as the sort of person who has the perspective on how the Chinese might be looking at all of this. But to me, I guess the DPRK issue seems now to be all about narrative battles and not really about diplomacy or about trying to make meaningful progress. I mean, it just seems like we've put the issue back into the strategic patience basket without saying so. And I should just say that at Yale Law School, you know, everyone gets A's, so I'm not going to proceed along the tough report card that Bob Gallucci gave out, but I certainly understand why he's a hard grader and why he gives those marks. You know, I also think that it's not just the case with the US and the DPRK that we're stuck in these narrative battles. We also see the same thing currently, of course, in US-China relations, maybe even more so. There's no diplomacy. There's very little impetus to pursue efforts with China on the part of the US, you know, based on any kind of realistic assessment of how the other side sees the situation. And I think that's true in both the dealings with the North Koreans and also dealings with China. You know, it probably has something to do with the fact that the Biden administration is facing a lot of crises and problems of its own. And it's probably, you know, it has a pretty cold and hard assessment of the likelihood of progress on North Korea after the Trump efforts, right? So, you know, how much are you gonna effort are you gonna put in on something where you feel like you're just gonna be banging your head against a wall is something reasonable from the standpoint of an administration that's got a lot on its plate. You know, I think the question of U.S. cooperation with China on North Korea, do we see that? Is it possible? This is something that people usually raise and mention. The short answer is such cooperation is not happening and is probably not in the offing realistically. You know, the Chinese see themselves currently as in this kind of full-on struggle against U.S. containment efforts. And, you know, they're not really interested, frankly, in removing or helping us to remove North Korea as a challenge that we have to face and consider, I'm afraid. I think, what Bob Carlin just said is really important for us to consider. I mean, the North Koreans used to see the US as a potential balancer against a China that they were concerned about being too dominant in their foreign policy calculus. But now the North Koreans are watching, I feel, with glee, this kind of dust up between the US and China, and see that they can count on China's unconditional support in the context of this clash between the two superpowers. And so I think, China joining with Russia in the UN Security Council to block any kind of new resolutions or statements even on these recent barrage of ballistic missile launches is a clear, indicator of the way things seem to be headed from North Korea's perspective. The Chinese, when we raise the issue of North Korea, now their line tends to be that we need to consider North Korea's legitimate security concerns. They'll raise, exercises and our threatening posture as a reason for DPRK behavior. I think US overtures to China and North Korea are not really taken seriously. They're probably actually not really meant that seriously. Apparently, President Biden, during his meeting with Xi Jinping in Bali in November, raised, in a kind of list of areas of cooperation, the prospect of US-China cooperation on Korea, and basically got no response. That could be because of the way the conversation flowed, but it seems to be that the Chinese are now kind of interpreting this as a sort of a throwaway line. I don't think the Chinese will act boldly to support the DPRK. They'll still try to respect the sort of letter of the sanctions. And we can talk, if we want to, about how much trade and other material and is getting across the border, how well the sanctions are being enforced, whether that's even relevant at this point. I think the Chinese do still want to be seen as a responsible actor on this issue, since it is a UN Security Council involved issue. There are resolutions, etc. The Chinese today put out their Global Security Initiative. Interestingly, talks a lot about the UN Security Council, all kinds of different fora for resolving hotspot issues and problems and conflicts, and tries to sort of make China out to be a supporter of the existing global system, but also an action-oriented, security problem solver. But North Korea is not mentioned in the entire text of the document. So that probably gives us some indication of how they are looking at the prospect of international cooperation on the North Korea issue. I guess it's a couple of things I think would be interesting to explore in the context of the the China-North Korea relationship. One, there haven't been any real visits. Obviously, COVID-19 is the main explanation for that, probably, but we haven't seen anything since 2019, really, in terms of active diplomacy between the two. There's the question of the nuclear test. We haven't seen a nuclear test since 2017. And we know the Chinese are much more exercised about nuclear tests than they have been traditionally about missiles. And I think another very important question is this question about cyber hacking and how much support the Chinese may be giving, or tacit sort of turning a blind eye to North Korea's activities in this area, and what will happen going forward if there's a lot more international activity to try to stop that. On the whole, I guess my report card on prospects for US-China cooperation on North Korea would be a lower than the usual Yale grade, approaching probably Georgetown grades in general.
Thanks, Susan. Jenny?
Thanks, Joel. And it's great to hear everyone's views on this. And I tend to agree with a lot of the grading that's gone on. I would say I've been asked to talk a little bit more on the South Korean side and US policy towards South Korea as an ally. And I agree with Bob Gallucci in terms of, I think the US has put in a lot of effort on this. Maybe A minus range in terms of actual effort. And in really trying to rebuild support and confidence within the alliance that they're prepared to deal with the range of contingencies that exist now, and the heightened anxieties that exist, especially after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has had a huge psychological effect in Asia. But I think it's really hard to balance that and the emphasis on strengthening alliances for US interests in the global realignment according to this values-based world order. And with the idea of how much of our engagement is about US interests versus also understanding South Korean interests and taking more of South Korea's interests into heart. And I do think there has been at least some internalization within this administration and internalization and responsiveness to growing ROK anxieties, growing South Korean anxieties, that has led to reviving, for instance, extended deterrence consultation, and more serious discussions about the future of US ROK defenses. And it's taken us a long time, I think, to get there, to really understand that these anxieties exist and that and why the South Koreans continue to question US commitment, US credibility, despite the fact that we have troops there, despite the fact that we have the Mutual Defense Treaty, and all of the ways in which the US believes that it's signaling that we have a strong commitment there. And I think, part of this is really a lot of questions of how conflict unfolds with heightened US-China tensions, the idea of what if there's a contingency over Taiwan, if there's US resources already tied up into that, what does North Korea do? And how might the US be distracted from or prevented from responding in full force? I think there's a lot of still really alive emotional scarring from the way that the Trump administration treated alliances. And Trump's calls for the removal of troops, withdrawal of troops from South Korea during his administration, and then seeing the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan later under the Biden administration. While even though it's a very different arrangement, it certainly did have an impact on the possibility of it happening in the future to South Korea. And I do think it also, there's a lot of questions that are rising in Asia among our allies in South Korea and Japan as well about, what is the US willingness to engage with a country that has nuclear weapons? And I think they've seen a lot of kind of reluctance to get directly involved militarily in the Russia-Ukraine conflict because of Russia's nuclear status. And I think there's a lot of concern of what happens if North Korea were to attack South Korea. And would the US show similar kind of reluctance in that situation in order to avoid a nuclear conflict? This is a situation where, again, I think the US has been responsive to this, has tried to deepen consultations, but it's not going to be easy. There's no easy answer to this. It isn't like, hey, if we just add one more working group, it's going to solve these issues. This is going to have to take a prolonged, sustained, and consistent effort. It's going to have to be sustained over a couple of administrations to rebuild that trust that the US policy isn't going to shift drastically on alliances in the future from administration to administration. And I think it really means too that there's no room right now for what we like to call Korea fatigue of, the South Koreans are always asking too much and asking too often. But I think that's the reality of where we are now, is that there's just simply a lot of concerns and a lot of belief that nuclear conflict is possible. But I think there's also this underlying assumption in the US especially that this is when it comes to the way that the South Koreans are responding to this and some of the recent statements about the potential for South Korea wanting nuclear weapons and pursuing nuclear weapons, I think there's an underlying assumption that this is an either or situation. If we can find the right mix of extended deterrence, reassurance, signaling that it is going to prevent and dispel this notion that South Korea, or dispel the desire for South Korea to pursue its own nuclear weapons. And I know we've had a discussion here with 38 North about this issue in general, but I do think there's more and more evidence that this perception in South Korea about nuclear weapons is not an either or, but is really moving towards a both. They want both. They have high confidence. If you look at public polling, for instance, in South Korea, they have high confidence in the alliance and in the alliance in the US commitment to respond in case of conflict when it looks at public polling, not the policy community, but the actual general public perception. But it also has, high acceptance of the idea that South Korea should have nuclear weapons. So they believe in the alliance. But I think there's a growing belief that the only thing that really prevents a nuclear weapon state from attacking another state is nuclear weapons. There's also other factors that drive that in terms of, the ongoing conflict, U.S.-China competition, and the prospects of being pulled into a regional conflict. But there's also then the prestige factor. And I think in a previous discussion, we talked about how the number 2 rationale for South Koreans to want nuclear weapons is the prestige. And I think it is, one of a very hard case to make when, North Korea has been successful in obtaining nuclear status, nuclear weapons, and is higher in the agenda than they would be if they didn't have nuclear weapons. And so I think there's a lot of questions about how do you change that perception of the role of nuclear weapons in, broader regional reputation in the international community. But I think there's also, the reality is that there's a growing belief, I think, that South Korea is justified in wanting nuclear weapons. And we've seen several articles pop up over the past few months as to why, because of the situation under Article 10 of the NPT, that they would be justified in withdrawing because of the crisis situation. I think so far from the US, there has not been a real clear statement that a ROC decision would be unacceptable. The ROC decision to go nuclear would be unacceptable. And I think there's broader questions as to how do we restore faith in the nuclear non-proliferation treaty regime in general after Russia's violation and attacking Ukraine. I would say, I think, when it comes to the US and South Korea's more muscular responses to what North Korea is doing in terms of their testing, which has led to also then North Korea to do a lot of more muscular responses and rhetoric. And as Susan said, really a battle of narratives here as to whose fault this is and who's the instigator here, a little bit of the whole chicken and egg. I think we really need to think about how do we respond in non-military ways and try and de-escalate those cycles. And I think, while we try to figure out how to strengthen extended deterrence, we also need to be thinking about how do we restore diplomacy, and can we do it in a more limited way to be able to get to those discussions, not only with the North Koreans, but also with the Chinese in terms of, as we build up, alliance capabilities, how are the Chinese perceiving this, and how can we in some way reassure them that this isn't us leading towards conflict, but that better mutual understanding about the balance of power in the region. And I do think that leaves a lot of room for sort of third-party intervention and some peer pressure in this situation. If the US and South Korea and North Korea are all embroiled in this sort of escalatory cycle, to see, other countries, potentially calling for talks about de-escalation and tension reductions. And I'll leave it there, Joel.
Thanks, Jenny. So I think what we've heard from our four speakers, and I would second that, is a pretty depressing, bad situation. And, I guess you couldn't blame the Biden administration for, focusing on other situations and trying to keep this on the back burner, but it's not going away. And that's the problem. It's going to get worse and worse and worse. And we've seen signs of that already, certainly in South Korea, and it may get worse there, but there's more to come. So with those two trends easily identifiable, the issue becomes for us on this panel, what should we do? What should we do? Forget about whether it's going to work or not. I mean, you're going to try to do something that may work. And I think there are a lot of elements here that could be part of that strategy, particularly, in the non-military areas. And I think it has to come from Washington. That's the other thing I've been hearing from everyone. So why don't I go around and very quickly, because, we have about 50 minutes left, and I do want, as I said earlier, get to questions from the audience, but let me go around and see what the thoughts are of the panelists about what should we do now, not what's wrong. And I'm going to start with Bob Gallucci.
It is interesting. Thank you, Joel. But it's interesting as I listen to my colleagues. There isn't a lot of daylight between us. I mean, it isn't there's another view of what's going on. I think we all feel as though the U.S. hasn't done enough to try to resolve this threat to international security in Northeast Asia, and never mind national security of the United States. And we should be trying to figure out what we might do, and it should be something different from what we have been doing. And having said that, I'm in danger of repeating myself, but it hasn't stopped me before. So I do believe that we need to understand how important normalization was in the past, and I suspect still is to the North Koreans. That if we put out in front of the North Koreans the idea that our military exercises are not intended to threaten them, that just is not good enough. We need to do something that is materially different. We need to put some, I don't know whether Bob used this expression, red meat or something on the table here. We need to do something. And the things that occur to me, and I'm not the one to think of all the areas in which we can be creative in a new initiative with the North, but so I'm not trying to be creative. I think that a look at sanctions wouldn't be a bad idea. There's a reason to have sanctions in place other than to motivate the North, and is a demonstration of serious concern about activity which we regard as illegitimate, even if we don't think the sanctions are going to have that kind of enormous impact that it's going to change policy in the North. So we can dial back some sanctions, I think, without catastrophic consequences, and that would be substantive. I think much richer as an area, Joel, for us to look at, and this is not the right panel for it altogether. Some of us may participate in one, but to get some of our military colleagues, particularly ones in uniform that are still responsible for readiness and are still responsible for the defense of South Korea and meeting our obligations under the alliance, but to do something about the character, particularly the profile of our joint military operations with the ROK. I have become persuaded, listening to North Koreans over some decades, that they are not amused by decapitation exercises called decapitation exercises. I think there are things we can do here that would not substantially damage the working relationship between our two military organizations that would be of interest to the North. So I would be looking for stuff like that, to put substantive stuff into an initiative with the North, but an initiative that says, look, we are aiming at normalization. And while I yield to no one in my enthusiasm for keeping a goal of a nuclear-free Korean Peninsula, our goal, I don't feel any need to keep shoving it down their throat. I know we're not going to make any huge steps on denuclearization today or tomorrow. So I think to emphasize normalization, and in a normal relationship, then if we ever got close to it, the North would not feel the need, which they apparently do now, to have not only nuclear weapons, but a growing nuclear weapons capability. So, I'd be a little tactful in how we proceeded here. And I'd also have some substance behind that tact. I would not be looking right away to freeze activity at Yongbyon or the other kinds of things, which I thought actually were very significant single steps towards denuclearization. And if we got there again, that would be good news. But I wouldn't, Joel, right now be leaping to that. I'd be looking at what we can do to demonstrate that we want to have a normal relationship with this country. It is fundamentally in our interests, as we consider our posture in the Asia-Pacific region and the growing influence and capability of China. We have no interest here that anyone who has a hint of geopolitical thinking in their skull to have a continued alienated Korean Peninsula here with North Korea. If we could fix that, get back more towards what Bob was talking about, was the way he thought the North used to think for so long about its position in geopolitics in the Asia Pacific, what the United States wanted, what China wanted, et cetera. That is something that the realities, the power realities of that thinking are still there, and we should take advantage of them. And I think that's the thing that's driving me a little nutty, that there's an opportunity here geostrategically, which we're not seizing and we can use. Thank you.
Okay. Bob Carlin, let's throw into the mix that, maybe the old jingles aren't going to work anymore for a reason, and that is the region has changed. The region is changing, and particularly, the arms race that's going on in the region, not just, North Korea and China, but Japan, South Korea, to some degree, the United States. So I'm wondering, should that somehow be part of a new approach? Would something in that mix sort of resonate in Pyongyang?
Joel, this is an old problem I've faced before. The administration, having jumped out of an airplane at 30,000 feet without a parachute, then looks around and says, what do we do now? We're suffering from so many bad decisions over so many years that I know you want us to look for things that might not work, but we should be discussing. It's just so difficult to do. Let's go from easy to difficult. First thing we have to do is stop backing ourselves into a corner, which we have done. If there's a 7th nuclear test, we've already suggested we are going to bring holy hell to the North Koreans. And if we don't do that, we're going to look very, very silly. I'm afraid what's going to happen if there's a ICBM test at range into the Pacific. I'm afraid that Washington will really become much less coherent in terms of its policy response than it already, I mean, look at what happened with the Chinese balloon, for heaven's sakes, much less a North Korean missile. So we need to be ready for that. We need to look at the statement the Secretariat issued yesterday in terms of a 3-point approach to picking out parts of the problem and seeing if Russia, China, and the US can't begin to address them. And one of them is what Bob Gallucci discussed, which is sanctions. Why do we have to keep the whole sanctions array on all the time? The Chinese and the Russians argue, look, the North Koreans had already made some of their moves in response to the sanctions. At that time, there were no missile tests. There's still no nuclear test. Why can't we figure out a way to look at purely sanctions that are affecting the population disproportionately and do something with those and see how the North Koreans respond? I would, if we want a really big move, and here I'm picking up what Bob said about the North Koreans maybe still want normalization. If we want a really big move, which for sure Washington won't do, but I think would have pretty profound impact on North Korea, is to recognize the DPRK. Suddenly that would talk about not undercutting their rhetoric or even their approach about hostile policy, all that stuff. Establishing embassies in both capitals would make I think would make a big difference. Problem is, I don't think the South Koreans would stand for that for 2 seconds. The final thing is, you're right, the North Koreans have begun speaking in terms of regional equilibrium and the need, and also equilibrium on the peninsula. And so that may be a way into, as Bob suggests, a way into interim steps to deal with the arms buildup by both sides, by suggesting to the North Koreans that we agree with them that this is a problem. We think this is a question that both sides need to think about and talk about, and that's where we're willing to start. And it doesn't have nuclear in it. It's an issue that I think the North Koreans feel they could engage us on, because it would in effect recognize the fact that the US is as much a part of a problem as they are.
Thanks, Bob. Susan, I think, we're seeing, if these kinds of steps are taken, and maybe some others you might suggest, would that create more possibilities for cooperation with China?
Yeah, good question. I mean, of course, the Chinese have been mentioning things like sanctions lifting, and of course, addressing North Korea's legitimate, quote unquote, legitimate security concerns, et cetera, as things they think we should do. I mean, if we did them, I'm not sure. Well, first, they might fall off their chair, but second, I'm not sure that they would be more inclined to actually cooperate with us, given, the overarching kind of environment now in US-China relations. So, I mean, I think probably if we're thinking about doing something, that would be very dramatic, like all the things you all have mentioned, which I can't see actually happening, but it would probably in Washington be in the context of doing something to undercut, kind of China's relations, I think, with North Korea, or at least their position in the region. So I would be really worried about doing anything that would lead us in any way away or make the North Koreans think that we're dropping the goal of denuclearization. I know neither of the Bobs said that, but that's one thing in the background that, of course, the Chinese and the Russians claim that is their sort of underlying also ultimate interest in North Korea, although they have other interests, obviously, that don't line up with ours. But I think from our own perspective and from the perspective of sort of long-term management of this issue, it's got to be very carefully done, whatever way we start an engagement. I guess the other thing I would just say is, engagement has been shown to have the result that the North Koreans don't test as much. So, why are we offering dialogue without, it seems to me it would be in our interest to get the dialogue going, and giving something that we might give in order to get the dialogue going is in our interest to stop the testing, which is the biggest concern right now, I think. So, but I don't know what, I don't know what jingles we can offer now that are going to be credible to get them involved in a dialogue. I mean, I think we're just so far down this road. I really worry about, how we're ever going to get back to some kind of credibility in this dynamic.
Well, and I think in the case of China, Susan, correct me if I'm wrong, obviously the US-Chinese relationship comes into play in terms of North Korea. So if that still remains very tense, then whatever we do in terms of what the Bobs have suggested probably won't create an opportunity for cooperation.
I don't think so, right?
So it depends on that bigger relationship, really.
Yeah, I would also say that I would say the Chinese are quite skeptical of basically US intentions with regard to the Korean Peninsula at this point too. I mentioned that, of course, they now want to use North Korea as a strategic asset against the US in the competition, but they think the US is also trying to use the Korean Peninsula as a strategic asset against them in this competition. So from that perspective, I don't think either side is really interested in making any progress on this issue, unfortunately. And that, kind of cataclysmic clash of superpowers is gonna overwhelm this issue, I'm afraid. So unfortunately, I have to I have to say I'm very pessimistic, but I am all for changing up the equation. And I think we've tested the issue of sanctions to see whether that was gonna bring any kind of knuckling under from North Korea or any kind of enticement to bring them back to dialogue. It's certainly been, I think, more than proven that these sanctions are not going to make any difference, especially since the North Koreans sealed off their own border and shut themselves off from the world. It seems like they can cope at sort of almost any level of privation. And so, trying to lift a sanction just to shock the world and show that sanctions can be lifted at some points would maybe be something to try. I guess I would join the chorus that doesn't think that it's probably very realistic to think that's going to happen, but it would certainly throw the Chinese narrative, off. And that would maybe be in and of itself, in the UN Security Council and with the Russians and the Chinese, worth doing at this point. We'll see.
Bob Carlin, you just a quick two finger?
Yeah, quick. We're focused on the Chinese role in all of this. I think we should be concerned that there's a potentially growing defense relationship between North Korea and Russia. And I'm not just talking about ammunition to the Wagner Group. I'm talking about the possibility that the Russians and the Chinese would begin to see North Korea as useful as an active participant in their own defense coordination in Asia. And it seems to me that that's going to lead us to multiple times more difficult situation in the area. And we should be thinking about ways to head that off if we could.
Thanks, Bob. Good point. Jenny, I think one thing that if you could touch on, sure, a lot of what we're talking about, people think the administration isn't going to do it. I get that. But the other barrier there is also South Korea would never agree. And I wonder, that, of course, that may be true, but, should we be so dead certain about that?
Thanks, Joel. I just wanted to add real quick to the China point first before we move on. I think I've heard several times a lot of Americans, when engaging in discussions with the Chinese, often pose the prospects of cooperation on North Korea as you should do more because it's in your interest, because if you don't do more, then there's going to be this massive buildup of weapons in the system or weapons in the region, and this is against your interests. And I find that a really problematic way to pose the discussion and pose the invitation for cooperation, especially given how most scholars in Beijing don't believe that a lot of moves that we're taking in terms of missile defenses are meant for defense against North Korea to begin with. I think it's all targeted towards China anyway. So I think there's ways in which if we can get to discussions with the Chinese about cooperation, I think there is actual room for cooperation, but not when it's posed in such a rivalry-oriented way. In South Korea, I think the views on North Korea's nuclear status and leading with denuclearization are really evolving. And I think, maybe 5 years ago, if you had said, hey, let's try to talk about normalization or try to talk about peace or try to talk about anything other than denuclearization first, you would have gotten a lot of pushback to say that, no, we can't do that because if we don't lead with denuclearization, then, we're accepting North Korea as a nuclear state and we'll never get there. But I think there's a lot of views are evolving in South Korea as to what's actually a useful narrative. And so you do hear a lot more, even on the conservative side, of people that are willing to not lead with denuclearization, knowing that that's the hardest thing to achieve. And right now we are so far from achieving that or making progress on that we really do need to find a way to have a more productive relationship first in order to get back to those discussions. I think there's a growing group of conservative politicians, for instance, in South Korea that are calling for exactly what Bob were talking about before, about can we normalize relations and can we exchange embassies in order to be able to create the channels of communication, in order to build some level of trust, in order to get back to the kinds of security-oriented discussions that we need to have. So I think there's a lot of recognition that what we have now isn't business as usual, but that we have turned a corner, and that we do need to start thinking about new ways to approach the situation that could create new pathways or more productive pathways forward, instead of just punish, isolate, and continue to watch North Korea barrel forward.
Thanks, Jenny. So what I want to do now is open the floor for questions, and we have a number of questions in the chat room. And so let me start. I'm scrolling through them, and I think there's a very good one here that I want to start out with, which is, are we faced with a Hobson's choice now? If we continue to enhance the credibility of extended deterrence in order to prevent the ROK from going nuclear, do we close the doors to normalization? And I think it's also the opposite. If we pursue normalization and pull back on military exercises, do we weaken the credibility of extended deterrence? I think that is a really good question. How do you deal with those, what appear to be competing objectives? I'm going to turn to Bob Gallucci, since he teaches courses on extended deterrence.
Thanks, Joel. I was actually beginning to chuckle because in another week it's the extended deterrence week, and one of the required readings for the students in my seminar is one that says there are three functions that have to be performed when you're dealing with a situation which you would like to regard as successful extended deterrence. And one is you have to deter this potential enemy from attacking not only you, but your ally, right? So you've got to express deterrence successfully. Second thing is you have to assure your ally that you are in fact going to show up if the deterrent threat is called or not believed, if deterrence fails, in short. So there's an assurance function as well as a deterrence function. And the third function goes back to that potential enemy, and it's a reassurance that what we're doing to be credible at deterrence and to be credible to our ally may look to you not like extended deterrence, but like an aggressive first strike posture. And we want to assure you that what we're doing is not that. But we can't just be verbal with extended deterrence. It's got to have substance to it. So what this really means is that if you want to square this circle, whether you're talking about Europe and the former Soviet Union, or you're talking about Northeast Asia, or you're talking about China and other issues we may have, including Taiwan, that you've got a number of things to do that are not all connected in a very constructive way. So I think that, Joel, you're and the questioner is right to suggest that in our enthusiasm to extend deterrence, we can and reassure an ally, we can look pretty threatening. And it flies in the face of what I have understood our national security advisor would like us to believe we're projecting as a declaratory policy, which is no hostile intent. So I think all this says to me is that you're not really going to square this unless you do certain things, but you also have to be in a dialogue of some kind. The signals themselves are not going to work, and any more than just a dialogue is going to work. We have to look at what is particularly threatening to them, what we can do to be for me, it is a good thing that the United States does not need to redeploy nuclear weapons to the Korean Peninsula to be credible at deterrence, right? It may help a lot with assurance to our ally, but we shouldn't be doing it for that reason. We should stick to the deterrent requirement. And it certainly is important to reassuring the North Koreans that's not where we want to go. So, I think thinking about these as three separate functions is a useful conceptual idea. And I think it's possible to do. The North Koreans, I think you will recall, can be very sophisticated when talking about this stuff. And I think we as can the South Koreans, I think that discussion can be very, very useful. But we have to think it through, and we actually have to be in a position to have that discussion. And we're not right now.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It's one thing to take all these steps without any communication with the other side. But at least if you have some communication, maybe you can navigate your way better through these steps. There's another question here, and no one has really raised this issue, but I'm going to raise it since we're talking about things that the Biden administration probably isn't going to do. There's a question here about how about if the United States made it clear that ultimately it is in everyone's interest to ratify a treaty to end the war. And I assume that doesn't mean just the end the war declaration, but actually to start peace treaty negotiations. It seems to me that would have a pretty big impact. And I don't know if everyone would just jump right on board or not, but I think it would have an enormous impact. I don't know, Bob, Carlin, what do you think?
I suppose if it were done, in the right way, it would have a positive impact, but there are so many snakes and alligators on the road to that I worry we couldn't get there. I think that, let me continue with that, but let me go back real quickly to what your first question and what Bob was saying. It seems to me that this is not a zero-sum game, that it's, if we were to get normalization with the North Koreans, we wouldn't need extended deterrence so much in up their noses. It simply wouldn't be necessary. As Susan said, they'd stop testing probably, and they'd do some other things that would lower the temperature, which would make it easier for us to have extended deterrence in the background rather than up front. That's just a thought I had. As far as the peace treaty goes, there was a time when I think it would have been extremely effective. Right now, if we were suddenly to bring it out, it might look like a trick to the North Koreans. So we'd have to sidle up to it. But at that moment, at that right moment, then yeah, maybe it would be a useful addition.
I'm going to ask you a little bit to clarify that a little bit. When you say sidle up to it, what would you mean by that?
Well, we couldn't out of the blue
just announce it.
Yeah, we couldn't just do it out of the blue. You need to have other jingles and other side discussions, which we're not having, and then maybe it would be the appropriate time to raise it. That's all.
Susan, you have two fingers up.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to mention after the two Bob's comments here, how, basically what they're talking about is credible diplomacy, right, with North Korea. And, we've been now doing this for a long time. And I think if you look at the whole issue from the side of the North Koreans, I mean, there's just so little credibility that we bring to the table now in any kind of conversation. So the question is really like, how would you reestablish some minimum level of trust? I mean, as Bob said, if we announced a peace treaty, they'd think it was a trick. There's so much distrust on the part of the North Koreans, and I can't see, I mean, I wonder if anyone has a good suggestion about how to restore some, level of credibility. It strikes me that, people, savage the six-party talks, et cetera. But part of the way we did this in a previous era, when we also had problems with credibility in the diplomatic conversations with North Korea, we got other actors involved. And I think, we've been talking about cooperation with China, and that's not in the offing, obviously, but what about other actors coming in to sort of try to make a diplomatic conversation more credible? And this has been tried, through the years by various Northern European countries, et cetera. I mean, I don't see an easy way to get there, but I think this is going to be a fundamental problem for trying to really get anything going again from where we've been now after Hanoi and et cetera over.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point. I mean, it's nice to have these really headline catching initiatives, but before we do any of that, how do we deal with this trust issue? How do you restore trust? And I don't know whether it's new jingles or, private back and forth that might lead to some restoration, or does anyone have any ideas on that front? Bob? I'm sorry, Bob Bellucci.
I myself don't like the word trust. It doesn't seem to me to capture anything like anything I have ever had with North Koreans, or I must say with any number of other countries I negotiated with over decades. Trust is it's just not a good word.
Okay,
I like skin in the game, vested interest. I like the idea that we are putting some effort. You know, you name somebody, they go forward with a group, they meet somewhere, the other side does the same thing. They're both kind of exposing themselves a little bit. They got to play defense back home to people who think that's stupid. I mean, so they get involved. They got something going on, and I think if I were translating what Bob said into kind of everyday terms of a bureaucrat in the State Department, I would say, you know, you don't want to just, you know, announce this to the North Koreans on CNN. You know, you want to talk to them about it, and then you want to work the inside of the department and figure out how to do it and get something going, and understand you're going to defend yourself from a right flank that is going to get attacked, but you do it anyways. But you get an interest in it, and they get an interest in it, and so, you know, it becomes a question of, you know, remember I said before, you know, it's the old, is the game worth the candle? You know, well, it's always going to cost you something. The candle's always going to cost you something. So you got to start looking as though the game has got something in it for them. And once they have something in it, once you both do, then I think big ideas like Bob's, which was a big idea, you know, then that has some place to go. Coming out of nowhere, you know, they're going to look, and that they're going to ask, is the Trump administration back or what? So I would second his orientation, but I would discourage us from leaping on the word trust as something that we're going to establish anytime soon. I mean, I'm working on it with my neighbors next door. It's still a work in progress.
And Bob Carlin, you've been around this block many times before, you know. How do you start reestablishing whatever you want to call it, you know, chips in the game, trust, confidence? How do you do that process?
Well, it has to be step by step. I hate to say it, I choke on this, but action for action. Everybody has to do something in response to whatever the other side did. And that allows the negotiator to go back, as Bob said, goes back to capital and say, see, we got something. We can get more, but we're going to have to put something into it. This process is ridiculed by a lot of people. Process is critical to this whole thing. And it's not trust, it's cold, hard calculation of what works in the short run and what's going to be sustained. What Susan said was the North Koreans don't believe we can sustain these things. It's been proven to them in their mind that we cannot. That's why keto was set up for the North Koreans the way it was, because they wanted a long-term US commitment. So we need to have short-term things that allow us to build up to the next level and not worry too far in the future, because we may never get there. So what can we do in the short term that will actually have benefits to our national security?
And I think another issue that Susan has raised is there a role for other countries? I mean, honestly, I've always been very skeptical about a role, except maybe, you know, providing a capital for the United States and North Korea to meet, but maybe that's changed. Is there a role for other countries? I'm not seeing any takers. So, Jenny, please.
I just want to echo what Bob was saying in terms of we need to start with a more limited scope if we want to get anywhere with North Korea and prove that we can actually produce results short term at first to make other things more possible. And I think that's why like these open-ended calls for negotiations without preconditions, you know, anytime, anywhere. And as Bob Gallucci started with, but to what end, right? Like, can we be more specific? Can we have a more limited scope in mind, propose it, be willing to actually deliver on something within a short period of time in order to start to build some track record, some skin in the game to show that results are actually possible. I think this is also an issue that really needs to be taken seriously within the alliance, and discussions that need to happen about, what is the political appetite in US, in Washington, in Seoul, in Tokyo, about a potential package deal in the future. So not just defense planning, but actual negotiation planning as well. If we can get to a stage where we can have a more productive conversation with the North Koreans, we shouldn't be scrambling at that point to figure out what we have to offer, what we're willing to do. But we should have at least some things that we know we can turn around quickly, and that all the capitals will go along with in order to help propel us forward. I really do think there is room right now for outside parties. And I agree the idea of like proposing a treaty, a peace treaty at this point in time is too big. Everyone knows a treaty is going to have multiple parties involved. It's going to take a long time to negotiate. It's going to have to deal with issues about, for instance, the role of the alliance on the peninsula. And those are discussions that we're not really in a place to have at this point in time. And that's why in the past, it was always a more limited scope of at least let's get the declaration out saying the war is over in order to get to, more productive talks on peace in the future. But in terms of the where we are now, I don't see the political will in Washington, especially, to take on a challenge that they have such low confidence in succeeding at in a real earnest way. And I think there's, we, as was mentioned before, since we are the stronger military, we should be the ones to take that first step. And I don't see that happening in this political environment. And so I do think there's room for some kind of mediation, some kind of intervention, a third party calling for talks on neutral territory, giving an actual diplomatic space for all sides to air grievances and to see if we can actually come to a more productive relationship within that, and start to move, at least in terms of tension reduction and limited measures, to start to move us in a different direction rather than leaving it up to Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo to try and Washington, Seoul, and Pyongyang to try and figure it out.
But, that begs the question. I mean, it sounds good in theory.
Yeah.
It sounds great. But who would do it, and who would we agree to participate with? I mean, that's the key issue, really. And I'm not hearing any countries, and I'm asking these questions because they're important, but I'm very skeptical.
I think it could, even if you started with one of the countries within the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, such as the Swiss or the Swedes, I think would be positioned well to try and broker that. And Bob's shaking his head no.
Swedes are no longer neutral. They're joining NATO.
They're in NATO. Well, nevertheless. Bob Gallucci, did you want to add?
Yeah, I want to make a nomination.
Oh.
I want to nominate Singapore.
Oh, that's an interesting idea. Why did you nominate them?
Because that's where Chen Hen-chi lives, and I think that would be a great way to go. A really smart person who knows the region, knows the United States. I think it would be someone like that.
Who is that?
Chen Hen-chi used to be ambassador in the United States.
Yeah, sorry, don't know her. Anyway,
well, I mean, I think a Southeast Asian country, an ASEAN country, might work.
yeah, it's a very interesting idea.
Does anyone have a good idea of, what North Korea wants at this point? Like, if we're going to bother to have proposals, is there a taxonomy of what we think the North Koreans are looking for?
This is leading to the issue that you hear repeatedly from US government people, which would be another argument against doing any of this, is why should we be throwing things at the wall to see what sticks? which is another argument for doing nothing. But anyway, Bob Carlin, I suspect the answer is we're not really sure at this point.
Right. Until we can talk to them, we have no reason to think that we have any good ideas about what they want.
Right. And to get to talk to them, we may have to throw something against the wall. Bob Gallucci, did you want to say something?
I think, Joel, that we're finding out that if you do nothing, that doesn't work.
Right.
So,
but a lot of this discussion has been, if you do nothing, it won't work, but no one wants to do anything.
why is it that we have gotten together today and there are lots of people, smart people. I've looked at the names of the people up there who have decided to join us. It's because a lot of us think we know a little bit about North Korea, and some of us think we know a lot about North Korea. I'm in the first category. I think Carlin's in the second category. The rest of you may be. So we know more than the average bear about what, and we've been watching carefully what they say about what they might want. So it's not like we're just making it up and we're just going to try wild ideas. We have some ideas about what they're interested in, what they would regard as serious. And I think a number of us are saying we ought to be proposing something serious soon, rather than repeating the same offer over and over again. We got to have something other than your father's Oldsmobile. We've been there, done that. It's not working out. So let's be a little more creative and aggressive. That's all. And it is this problem, as we have frequently said, does not get better with age. It ain't fine wine. There'll be more missile tests. There'll be nuclear weapons tests. There'll be more threats on the peninsula. The South may make a move that would really disturb us. This whole thing is not going in the right direction by us being very, very cautious. I will tell you that I don't know how you feel about it, but I think Susan's, used the words, or somebody did use the words benign neglect here, or the policy of pursuing this with not great vigor. But if you recall, there was an awful lot of talk about that happening during the Obama administration, because the judgment was that the game was not worth the candle for us, that we weren't going to step forward and get kicked in the teeth on this. We'd rather step forward in the Middle East and get kicked in the teeth than Northeast Asia, right? So I think that what we have to understand is that there's risk involved in this, and administrations are risk adverse and they're looking for wins. That's not a surprise. So yes, we have to be smart. We have to take a chance, and we have some basis for knowing what might work that's different than what we have been doing. But it ain't cheap, and there's a risk involved.
Completely agree. That's always the default button when people don't want to do anything. We don't know what they want. It's too risky. We have other priorities. It's been the same thing for 30 years. So, I think we all completely agree with that. So we have 7 minutes left. I don't know, Bob Carlin. We don't know what they want, do we? The situation has changed.
Well, we don't have to know what they want to take a step to indicate to them that we're interested in moving this thing in a new direction. We won't know what they want more precisely until we sit down and they let us know. That's not a problem. They have good I have always thought they have very good radars for sensing when the Americans are getting serious. And right now, they don't see it. Right now, they see Song Kim sitting in Indonesia. There's nobody committed to this process. There's no process. So their view is, well, what are we going to be talking about? To whom? Let's see the Americans, as Bob said, put some skin in the game, bureaucratic and otherwise. And until that happens, they'll just figure that we're wasting time, which they'd rather waste time testing missiles than sitting and getting nowhere.
And Jenny, I really like your idea of being proactive with the South Koreans. I mean, I think we were caught a little bit behind the curve on extended deterrence, and we're going to try to catch up. But being proactive on this side of the ledger too, having talks with them about this. But you think that if we were, there might be some way of reaching some common ground in terms of diplomacy?
I think there is room, and I think while there might not be consensus view in Seoul these days about what the best way forward on North Korea is, I think there's recognition that we have to do something different. And it's the same problem in Washington. There's a recognition we should do something different, but what, right? So I think there needs to be a parallel track of not only just talking about the defensive side and the reactive side of stuff, but again, really trying to better understand, if we do get back to the table, what are we willing to offer as like a package deal that we're not going to have to go and check later in the middle of negotiations of what our allies think about stuff? What are some easy wins that we could offer as allies? But also, there's a lot of shifting of conversation to arms control measures and things like that, where going forward, it is going to be harder to get North Korea to agree to like a moratorium on missile testing when South Korea is still missile testing some of the same kinds of systems. And so I think those discussions really need to happen, as well as what are we willing to actually put on the table in order to have a more attractive deal in the future.
It may not only be that, it may be, tell me if I'm way off base, it may be getting together somehow, South Koreans, North Koreans, maybe US too, on confidence building measures. And maybe there's room for a discussion about strengthening the 2018 agreement, which is, I think, probably under some threat now.
Yeah, and I think, not only confidence building measures, but a recognition that, offering aid isn't going to be the right reciprocal response to some kind of North Korean concession, and that there is really going to have to be a security component concession as well in order to create the right environment. Bob
Carlin, you had one finger up.
We need a serious policy review, not like the garbage that we've seen since 2001 or 2002. We need a Perry-type review that takes a lot of time and has some public profile, so the North Koreans can see that we did this seriously. And then when it's done, the person who has done it goes to Pyongyang and says, here's our new policy. Here's what we think. Over to you. That, it seems to me, would help change the dynamic and make them sit up and would test where they're coming from and where they want to go.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. That is something that I haven't heard recently. And I think that would, if it was done right, it could really be an important step forward. Certainly more, it would be better than the policy reviews we do at the beginning of administrations, including this one, which, disappeared beneath the waves after a nanosecond. Anyway, I think we're out of time. We have one more minute, but I'm just going to check any more questions. No, I don't think we have time for these questions. So I want to thank everyone. Thank the audience for being out there. I hope this was interesting. And thank all of our panelists. This was a great discussion, and hopefully we'll have more like this